So the next micro talk is Confessions of a WUI Dweller by John Van Doren. John Van Doren is president and co-founder of Fire Adopted Bailey, as well as the president of the KZ Ranch HOA, which is a recognized Firewise community. John?
Okay. It always looks so different once you actually get in front of the microphone. This is really a talk, maybe a little bit more personal. It's about me getting woke, or at least partially woke, and a little bit about community, beginning to get a higher level of awareness about wildfire. This is actually my view shed. It's also my watershed. I live at about 8,800 feet in the middle of Colorado, in the community of Bailey. And we moved, my wife and I moved there in 1997. We had maybe a tiny bit of an inkling about wildfire at the time. In Patty's survey, we probably would have answered yes, but our mind share for wildfire was like, some fraction of 0.5%. So we were just happy to be in the forest. We'd always wanted to live there. We had horses. We were right next to Pike National Forest. We could saddle up and ride into the forest. And we were bat down and happy. We didn't really understand that we were living in a ecologically unbalanced forest, and that could be quite dangerous. So then we had the snaking fire. This is 5 years in. We live about 5 miles on the other side of that smoke column. So that was the first time, our first kind of shock that we lived in an area that might have a serious wildfire. That particular fire had a type 1 team on it very rapidly. It was arson caused by a student in the high school. That's a high school you see there. So for the first time, we did something. I packed up a bunch of boxes, took them to the office. I was working just by background. I did turnarounds and startups in the manufacturing sector. So I usually worked very long hours, 50, 60 hours a week. Didn't have a lot of time to think about mitigating my property. At this time, I didn't know anything about mitigating. I didn't know what defensible space was. I didn't know what an ember was. I couldn't tell you the difference between lodgepole pine and a ponderosa. I just thought the forest was pretty beautiful. And so after this, we started to do a little limbing. And I took out a few trees. And I wasn't really doing fire mitigation, I was doing landscaping. It just looked like the trees were too crowded together and not that healthy, and I was bumping into the limbs with my head, so we did some work, but it didn't really have anything to do with fire. We were doing mitigation in our minds, although we actually were starting to do that. So fast forward now to 2011. At this point, I'm retired. And as I like to say, I was ambushed into becoming the HOA president, which is how most people become HOA presidents. And in Park County, most of the HOAs are voluntary. That means there's no rules, there's no mandatory dues. And so my first reaction was, what's the point? Why do we even do this? So I started calling around and talking to other HOA presidents that have been ambushed into the job. And I ran into one that was doing a limbing program. So he says, we're doing some limbing, we're doing some chipping to try and reduce the wildfire risk. And I said, okay, that's something we can all get behind. Let's do that. And I had him come in. By then we had an email list of some of our residents, so I put out an email blast and I said, who's interested in doing something? I brought this person in to talk to us. And one of the things he said is there might be money available with Colorado State Forest Service to help with this, because it's really hard to get rid of the slash. So at that point, we just went out and contacted the Colorado State Forest Service. We got a grant. We got a little grant for $15,000 to do forest restoration. So, number one thing in this grant was forest restoration. Number two was fire mitigation, defensible space. At the time, we didn't talk that much about ember hardening. So we started doing that. We got the grant. We started doing this work, and what we do, this photograph is a typical day in the life of mitigation back in KCHOA in 2011, 2012. And we go around, actually I went around first with the forester, and we marked trees, he'd paint trees. And then he kind of taught me how to do the same thing. And I learned a little bit about how our forests got to be the way they are today. I learned about fire suppression going back to 1910 and beyond, and how our forests were completely out of balance. So we started this project, and it was, everything we did was whole property. So all the way to the property line, we mitigated properties, the entire property, and it was with an eye towards forest restoration and less of an eye towards D-space, although we got the D-space done as well. So we would go out and we'd mark trees, and 2 or 3 of us would go out and we would drop the trees, and then we'd bring in 20, 30, 40 people, and we would have several chainsaws, and we delimb and we buck. This particular property, that was like a 40 tree day. We had 20 or so people working there. I didn't realize it at the time. We were doing saws and sloughs. And so we did that for a couple of years and finished our grant. Had about 1,000 hours of volunteer time. One of the impacts of that, or secondary impacts of that, is we had people that had lived in the neighborhood for like 20 years that never spoke with one another, that were now talking to one another. So that's my experience, Pat. That was part of it. The other part of it, this is, we brought in the Southwest Conservation Youth Corps. They came in. This particular property was 9 acres, and we brought a contractor in. We marked trees, and we brought a contractor in just to drop the trees. So we dropped like 300 trees. And then the youth corps came in, 8 of them, worked 4 10-hour days, and it was kind of felt like a logging operation. That driveway that we're sitting on there is a quarter mile long, and we had it stacked 4 feet high on both sides. Took all day to chip that driveway, just to chip that one driveway. So then we looked up from that, or I looked up from that anyway, and I said to myself, well, that's all well and good. We've done a lot of work in our tiny subdivision of 103 homes. We're now 80% mitigated in that subdivision, and that's full property mitigation, not just E-space. But I looked up and I said that that's really not enough. We really need to get more communities engaged in doing this work in the Bailey area. And so we formed a fire safe council at the time. We didn't know there was anything like fire adapted communities. We just didn't know. So we did that, and we went out, we put a presentation together, and we went out, started talking to other subdivisions. And when we started, we were at about 15, there were 3 Firewise communities. we were at a 15% footprint in the community in terms of number of residential parcels that were part of a Firewise community. And at the end of a year, we were up to 40%, and now we have 5 recognized Firewise communities and 3 more on deck, and the 3 more, if they get recognized, will take us to 60%. So it's a good story. But if you look at that footprint, we begin to ask ourselves, what does that really mean? You know, it's more a story, it's not really a story about reality on the ground. It's not like we have mitigated all those homes. It's really a story of a rising level of community awareness about wildfire. It's more that than anything else, at least at this point in time. At about the same time here, we also discovered that there was something called Firewise communities. And so we changed our name to Fire Adapted Bailey. And we started going through the self-assessment. And just to back up a little bit, most of my career I spent doing turnarounds and startups in the manufacturing sector. And so I loved the self-assessment because I needed a plan. I personally needed a plan, and the community needed a plan too. And the self-assessment takes you through this series of questions and becomes the framework for kind of a strategic plan for, at the community level, to become resilient. It also forces you to look at things at scale. And so when you stand back and look at this community that, how am I doing for time? Okay. When you stand back and look at this community at scale at 20,000 feet, which is completely different than cutting down trees on my individual parcel in Dragon Slash, you begin to see things a little bit differently. 5 minutes, he says. So first order of business, we had developed over the years with no planning. We had, been a ranching community, and then we subdivided the ranches starting in the 60s with no thought of evacuation. Completely inadequate roads for getting people out. So the first order of business was not de-space or timber hardening. It was how do we get people out safely. So we looked at, I'll just give you one example. We have one road that one way in, one way out, serves 2,500 homes, an elementary school, a Girl Scout camp, and a Christian camp. And it's a 60-foot right-of-way with a 30-foot road bed with heavy fuel loads on one or both sides. So the first order of business, how do we take care of those kinds of situations? So we brokered a deal between the county commissioners and our fire protection district, so the fire protection district could do the mitigation because they know how to cut a tree down and which one to cut down. And so we're going to start crowdfunding the initial effort to do that work later this month. So we're going to go crowdfund $100,000 so that our fire protection district can do that work. The other thing that we started to look at here is how do we do mitigation at scale? What about, we don't know anything about fire at the landscape level. How is fire going to behave in our landscape? And so we looked at, begin to look at, and the question, the major question that came to mind for us is, will the work that we do at the parcel level add up to being the right thing to do at the landscape level? And the answer for us right now is no, it won't. It's going to be too little, too late, and too random. We have a lot of Zone 3 footprint that is either not going to be mitigated or is going to be lightly mitigated. It's not going to be enough. So I need to move on. 3 minutes. Jeez. So, briefly on this. Yes. So this is what keeps me up at night more than anything else. If it was just 150 years of suppression and a few thousand paper mache homes plopped down in the forest, we could dig our way out of that hole. But now we're at 1 degree warming, and things are already starting to get crazy. If we're going to be at 2 degrees in the time frame it's going to take to fix this problem, so the question becomes, are we fighting the last war with our current prescriptions for mitigation? Should we be looking at a prescription for a 2 degree world instead of a 1 degree world? And that's way over my pay grade, so I'm going to go on. This comes right out of our self-assessment, and a quote from Bill McKibben. So winning slowly is the same as losing. So I looked at our private land footprint, which is 42,000 acres, and I looked at, one of the questions in the self-assessment is your funding adequate and reliable. So we've been running with grant money. Yeah, the answer to that for everybody in the room is no. But we've been running at about $250,000 a year. I thought we were doing pretty good getting grants for the last 10 years. But when you look at that, when you do the math on that, it'll take 150 to 200 years to get where we need to be. And in that time frame, I'm going to be planting seedlings in the burn scar and doing flood abatement rather than fire mitigation. So we need to move faster and smarter. So this began the search, looking for data. Patty, search for a multi-layered science-based plan. How do we move faster and smarter? The faster part for us is we concluded that we need to tax ourselves as a community and create a base of funding every year to do mitigation so we can plan and really begin to get a handle on this. And then the science-based thing, I've talked to probably a lot of people in this room. Is there a science-based approach that will allow me to strategically focus my mitigation dollars and get more leverage for the dollars I spend? And so something called FSIM is actually some modeling we're going to be doing in our footprint, both on our private and public land. That's 311 square miles. So that's the first layer of a plan going forward. So that's going to identify the locations of the fire starts and the weather conditions that will do the most damage in our community. The second layer, and this is after reading Mike Caggiano's blog about pods, potential operational delineations. When I read that, I said, well, okay, that's the next thing we need to do. We're going to be doing that as well. Be sure and go see what Mike has to say today. And I'm way beyond my time. Then we'll add in the subdivisions and the infrastructure and all that. We'll see where they fit into the landscape and into these pods. And then what we like to do in terms of communicating this information to our voters, our residents, our landowners, is we want to use the SimTable web-based version so we can show them, we put 100 people in a room, show them these fires that we've modeled and how they look at the landscape and how they would progress across these pods. And then the last layer is we're doing a new CWPP. We'll fold in the modeling and the pod analysis. And we've got Dave Lasky with the Forest Stewards Guild is going to be facilitating the building of this CWPP. So it'll be a community and lots of community engagement. So we'll work with the community as we develop both the plan, the model, and the pod analysis. And so they'll be part of the process. And that will set the stage, hopefully, for a voter-approved mill levy that will be dedicated to just doing mitigation in the neighborhood. So, how am I doing now? I have 1 minute. Yeah, you gave it to me now. You get, the other speakers gave me some time. Yeah, so, questions? Yes?
Do you have a mill levy on ballot now?
We don't have, we can't go to the voters until we have the plan. So, part of this thing, a database, science-based plan, that we go to the voters with and say, you know, we'd like, and we're talking about maybe $100 per household here is all we're talking about, because we're talking $500,000 a year as baseline funding, and then we tend to lever that in with grant money up to $1 million. Yes?
Hey, John, folks might not know about the self-assessment tool. Could you just say a few words?
Everybody doesn't know about the self-assessment tool.
They might.
Yeah. Part of being a fire-adapted community, part of one of the tools that they give you when you start to move in that direction is a self-assessment tool, which it's a series of questions that you ask yourself. And as you answer those questions, you begin to build a strategic framework and an action plan for moving in the direction of resilience. Does that cover it, Wendy?
Yeah, and you can ask anyone from the Fire Adapted Community Learning Network or FACO how to access that. It's on the web, free to download. You just want to know your email address and how to use it.
Okay. More questions? Yes.
Who are the partners who are engaged in Fire Adapted Bailey? Who are your primary partners when you say we? It sounds like it's starting more in your neighborhood, but working on CW.
So we have 5 recognized Firewise communities. Leaders from all 5 of those communities are on our board. We have a working group that consists of those communities plus the fire protection district, actually 2 fire protection districts, county, people from the county. They don't all come to the meetings every time, but that's the group we're working with. We're now working with U.S. Forest Service because they will be part of this FSIM modeling and the pod analysis. So they will work in conjunction with Platte Canyon Fire Protection District, the U.S. Forest Service, to define the polygons for the pods, and then the responses, pre-planned responses to a fire in each of the pods. Yes?
Is the mill levy going on through Fire Adapted Bailey, or is there a different organization?
The mill levy will be with the Fire Protection District, so it'll be a mill levy, but dedicated to only doing mitigation. They have a wildland fire module right now that's a 12-person module. We'd like to see that be a 36-person module, so that 24 of those people are always there doing